So I'm looking also, and you have it seems like you have a different layout than I do in your apartment. I want to be really clear that Alex is like behind this wall. Like that's what we're talking about. When we say we're neighbors, we don't just mean we live in the same building. He's literally on the other side of the wall every time I record one of these episodes.
It's a good apartment though, because like a good apartment building, because I've never heard you.
Really, I worry about that because I do be playing music sometimes.
No, I've never heard you. So it's like a
Okay.
good building with like sturdy walls.
Excellent, excellent, excellent to hear. I do hear an animal upstairs sometimes, which made me think, because when I first moved in, I never heard anyone. And I was like, great, this is a very soundproof building. I can push the limits of
Yeah,
my
yeah.
music playing and stuff. And then eventually I started hearing a dog or something upstairs. And I was like, oh shit. It's not that it was
Mm.
quiet. It's not that it's a soundproof building. It's just that everybody else was quiet except for me. So I appreciate the validation there. Um, Alex, I think one good thing about you kind of being at the end of your press tour is that it gives us an opportunity to focus on um, a little bit more things that are kind of outside of what was the narrative of the book. I'd like to ask you about the reaction to the book. I think there's a very different reaction that from like the Democratic establishment versus the left, kind of the Bernie left, if you would characterize it that way. And then some questions about how the book came to be written, and some of the substantive criticisms about why the focus on kind of the cover up as implemented by the White House insiders as opposed to journalists who, of course, played a role in all of this as well. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Are we recording already, or what are we doing?
Um, we can start now. We always start recording just in case. Sometimes the early patter ends up being interesting, and we end up doing a cold open.
Okay.
We,
Happy to
we
have our apartment neighborliness be the cold open.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. Then for those of you who are curious and decided to press play without reading the description of this episode, I'm here with Alex Thompson, who you may know as the co-author of the book that everyone's been talking about for the last couple of months, Original Sin, co-written with Jake Tapper. And it uncovers the enormous cover-up that happened within the Biden White House about his cognitive ability, age limitations, and his inability, it now seems obvious to everybody involved, to be an effective president for a second term in the White House. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast, Alex.
So glad to be here.
All right. So, as I just alluded to, there seemed to be an enormously different reaction to this book and to your speech that you made at the White House Correspondents' Dinner earlier this year, sort of calling out journalists for their role in this cover-up from the establishment core of the Democratic Party and from the left, who are mad, who had a complex reaction. We'll get to that in a second. First, I want to ask you how surprised you were by the pushback of saying out loud what to many of us seems sort of obvious, that Biden had certain cognitive limitations, and it was incumbent on us in the media to talk about those.
The White House Correspondents Association is as necessary as ever. President Biden's decline and its cover-up by the people around him is a reminder that every White House, regardless of party, is capable of deception. But being truth tellers also means telling the truth about ourselves. We, myself included, missed a lot of this story, and some people trust us less because of it. We bear some responsibility for faith in the media being at such lows. I say this because acknowledging errors builds trust, and being defensive about them further erodes it. We should have done better.
I mean, I wasn't surprised. The speech I gave at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, I did not expect to make friends in the room or even, the circle right outside the room by making it, which is honestly why I was sort of terrified to make it. But I just felt like the White House Correspondents Association was giving me an award for covering Biden's decline, which I had been aggressive on. But it was like, this is an award for something that even me, who had been aggressive on it, I, at that point, had done all the reporting for the book and knew that I hadn't even done enough. There were things that I could not get until after the election. But after the election, when we did the whole reporting of the book, there were things that I realized, like, if I had done this or I had done that, like, there were stories I could have gotten. So, listen, I think there is a risk as a reporter where if you think you're getting backlash, you obviously are doing the right thing and just like sort of being, intentionally provocative. But in this case, I knew that I was going to get, pushback and shit from both reporters, friends, and obviously partisans for both the speech and the book. And it did not surprise me at all.
Wait, so I'm curious about this allusion to the idea that there were stories that you still think you could have gotten more, that maybe you could have gotten out of sources. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So one example that I think I could have gotten. So after the election, I obtained months and months of Biden's internal schedule. So I had, and I had already written a story about his public schedule being very limited, right? The White House was mostly confining his public events between 10 and 4. And I wrote that in April of 2023. But the private schedules also show that his private schedule was also limited often to those hours. And there's like one day, the one day that always stands out to me is like October 3rd of 2023, when basically his day is like a few meetings from like 10 to 12, an hour for lunch, about 2 hours for what they dubbed POTUS time, 30 minutes of desk time, and then dinner and in the residence at 4:30. That's the whole day. And I feel that while there was stuff that was public that I reported on and called out, that was like a story. I probably couldn't have gotten the internal schedules like in print, but I do think I could have gotten bits and pieces of that if I had just like made, a dozen more calls. It's like you're always like, as a reporter, you're like you think, oh, if I had called this person or this source, like maybe I could have gotten this. So that's what I mean by that.
So, I mean, I take your point, and I sort of appreciate, and I think it's really to your credit that you're thinking in those terms. But, there's another part of me that thinks, well, in the grand scheme of the media's attention to stories relating to Biden's sort of cognitive capacity, the fact that you were covering it at all, and frankly, facing pushback. I mean, you write in the book about the sort of backlash against anybody who was willing to write about Joe Biden, and that there was a sort of designated group of flacks within the White House that were designated to pressure journalists out of covering Biden's cognitive capacity, right? So given that, one, that existed, that concerted pushback was existing from within the White House, two, that so many journalists seem to succumb to that pressure and not write stories about what was obvious to millions of Americans, as was reflected in polls. But, as you wrote about and covered in the book, majorities of Americans, and at some point overwhelming majorities of Americans, did not think that Joe Biden was fit to run years prior to the 2024 election. The fact that you were writing these stories at all is a real credit to you. Now, that being said, I mean, I think the elephant in the room is, why is there not as much focus on the media, in particular the liberal media's willingness to talk about Joe Biden's cognitive decline in the book? on some level, the story that's told in the book is damning, right? The insiders who ran cover for Joe Biden, who were close enough to him to know what was going on, and who chose to not disclose that to the public and to rearrange his schedule to try to, hide his cognitive state from the public and all of those kinds of things. It's horrible, but at the end of the day, that's their job, right? The media's job is different. It's different than protecting Joe Biden and making Joe Biden look good. And so can you walk me through the choice not to focus the critical lens as closely on your sort of peers in the media?
It's a great question. There were two main reasons. One is that Jake Tapper and I, we aren't media reporters. That I do think you could write an entire book about the media coverage of Joe Biden. We were political reporters. I covered the White House. I don't cover media. And so in the book, you will see there are sections about the media, but to your point, they are not the central focus by any means. I'd say the second reason is that, and this is sort of getting to like very much inside sort of the book publishing world, is that we pitched this book in November and we insisted that it had to come out in May or earlier. We basically went with the publisher that would get it as soon as possible. We were told we pitched a book at 50,000 words. We turned in 115,000 words. And we were told there is no way this book gets published at anything over 85,000 words. So there were more, and I say this to say, like, there was more media discussion within like the larger first draft. And some of those sections were cut because of like the intense timetable of publishing, and also sort of in some ways it's like crazy. Like the book was done like full edits like early March, and it still took like 10 weeks or whatever. Like that's just like the publishing schedule. So I think it's a completely fair question. I think there should be more discussion about the media part of this. But that was why it was not a huge focus of the book.
I mean, cynically, Alex, some might ask, does the fact that it was a project with Jake Tapper, who, as I'm sure you're aware, has been criticized as one of the journalists who was very closed, shall we say, to the idea of criticism of Joe Biden, who in a kind of a famous exchange with, was it Laura Trump?
Yes.
Really lashes it out back at her when she suggests that there was any cognitive impairment on Joe Biden's part.
How do you think it makes little kids with stutters feel when they see you make a comment like that?
First and foremost, I had no idea that Joe Biden ever suffered from a stutter. I think what we see on stage with Joe Biden, Jake, is very clearly a cognitive decline.
Okay.
That's what I'm referring to. It makes me uncomfortable
You are
to watch somebody on stage search for
That's so amazing.
questions
It's so amazing to me
and try and figure out an answer.
A cognitive decline.
Well, when you're trying to tell me that what I was suggesting was
I think that you were mocking his stutter. Yeah, I think you were mocking his stutter, and I think you have absolutely no standing to diagnose somebody's cognitive decline. I would think that somebody in the Trump family would be more sensitive to people who do not have medical licenses diagnosing politicians from afar. Plenty of people have diagnosed your father from afar, and I'm sure it offends you. Your father-in-law from afar. I'm sure it offends you. You don't have any standing to say.
I'm not diagnosing him. What I'm saying, Jake,
you just talked
is
about
that
a cognitive decline.
That Joe Biden
I have one last
struggling
question for you, Laura. You can't
times on stage, and it's very concerning to a lot of people that this could be the leader of the free world.
Okay.
That is all I'm saying. I genuinely feel
Laura
sorry
Trump.
for Joe Biden.
I appreciate it. I'm sure.
And in several other instances, in his reporting, attempts to diminish Wall Street Journal coverage and other coverage when it finally does start to emerge of Joe Biden's cognitive fitness, which, could make it difficult to co-write to credibly co-write a book about a media cover-up, right? When you're part of that media cover-up. What do you say to people who have that sort of take on why the book doesn't focus on the media?
I think it's just not true, but I also want to explain why I don't think it's true, at least from my lived experience was, when I was covering Biden, and I would say, like, I don't think I didn't have an axe to grind, but I felt I was just being like tough but fair. Um, you know, when you're on a beat for 4 years, which is what I was doing, the reporters that are tough, the reporters that are soft, the reporters that are suck-ups. I mean, you were on the Bernie campaign. Like, I'm sure you sort of had, like, you knew where the reporters lied, right? And the reporters know that too with their own peers. Tapper was never a Biden suck-up. I would say, like, there are many reporters on the Biden beat, or like just reporters in general, that if they had suggested this book, I would have said no way. Like, I would have never co-written with them. But Jake was not even like close on that list, because like I always felt like you talk about the Laura Trump thing, like that's like the best hit from Jake's critics is an interview from 2020. And I just don't think it's fair. Like, Jake has very much acknowledged that he didn't cover the age stuff nearly enough. But like, there was a lot more going on than just Biden's age, and like he was tough on Biden all the time. And in fact, like, he started, booking me on. If he was part of this sort of the media softness on Biden, he wouldn't have started booking me on his show when I was like being tough on Biden. So
when did he start booking you on his show? Was it
probably 2022, 2023? Like, especially when I was like covering sort of the stuff. Yeah.
So when you say this, do you mean the age stuff?
Yeah.
The original stuff?
And also just being in general, like being like a combative but fair reporter on Biden. Like, that's when Jake started booking me. And the book, I understand. Listen, like, I'm not throwing shade at the skepticism, the cynicism. Like, everyone has a right to, everyone should be skeptical and cynical in some ways. But I'm just telling you from like my perspective, like, I think Jake is like a tough and fearless reporter. And like, this book was his idea. And
so I was going to ask about that, how you came together as a writing pair. And I'm frankly, I'm kind of surprised to hear that it was his idea. In my head, it was you, as someone who I think should be credited for being consistent about this throughout your reporting during the Biden administration. Who, there's obvious benefits in the world of, publishing and trying to sell a book to be linked with a big name like Jake Tapper. He obviously has the platform at CNN to, talk about the book and publicize the book. And so I kind of assumed that you were the muscle and he was sort of like gilding the lily. But you're saying that he instigated this project to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't mind people just assuming that I'm the muscle here. And obviously what you're saying is true, is that like Jake is like much more famous than I am. And obviously that is a benefit to selling a book. That being said, the real truth of the matter is that the day before the election, I was on Jake's show. Afterward, Jake said to me, like, after we were off air, when we were off air, that he was like, I think Kamala Harris is going to lose. I've been thinking about this book idea. Like, I feel like there's more to the story about Joe Biden's decline. Essentially, is what he said.
So here's the pushback I just have to give. And it's not, I don't want to make you responsible for Jake Tapper. He's welcome to come on the show, and I'd love to put the questions to him himself.
Sure.
But with respect to the Laura Trump segment, that wasn't a one-off, right? You're saying that one was from 2020. I don't remember the timestamp on that.
Yeah, I think it's October 2020.
Another one, another exchange of note was between Jake Tapper and... Actually, can we just go ahead and play that clip, and then we can come back and talk about it?
False claims to the Wall Street Journal about President Biden's mental fitness and acuity. He's 81, and his memory, it doesn't seem great. It's not horrible, but I don't understand the outrage. Quote, behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping, unquote. The Wall Street Journal is owned by News Corp, which is run by the Murdochs.
You heard there Jake Tapper sort of contextualizing and downplaying the reporting from the Wall Street Journal about Biden's cognitive slippage, saying it's a Rupert Murdoch mag. Do you not read Jake's commentary in that way as trying to sort of diminish the legitimacy of the story by impugning the credibility of the paper itself?
I believe actually if you look back, what Jake was doing in that segment was that he was quoting what Democrats in the White House were saying about the Wall Street Journal story, which was to try to undermine the story. I do not believe he was actually himself being like, this is a fake story. And in fact, he had on the reporters from the Wall Street Journal story after the debate as well. So I just don't, I don't agree with that part.
I have to confess, Alex, I didn't read the clip that way. It's possible that if we, back out and look at the longer clip, that's what's going on. Mm-hmm. But I do think it feels out of step with our collective memory of mainstream MSNBC, CNN coverage of the 2024 race. To
well, that's a different
that
question.
What's the different? How do you see that as different?
Well, you're making Jake an avatar for all of that coverage.
Well, not necessarily. But he's a significant part of it, for sure, right? As one of the most popular.
He is like obviously a huge force, but I just don't put him in the same category as, all the. I put Jake in like a category of like a fearless journalist I respect. I would not put everybody in, that bucket in the same way, which is why I said like there are dozens of people, and I don't want to get into a name game here, but like there are dozens of people, if they had suggested this book to me, I would not have co-authored it with them. Jake, I never even thought twice about it.
Did you discuss the sort of the optics with Jake when you were starting to plan this project of what the optics would be criticizing the media when you had an opportunity as a major figure in the mainstream media to lead the charge on something like raising the red flag about Joe Biden's cognitive ability or some of these other concerns about like not having a primary? Because I got to say, I was co-hosting a news show during this time, and we spoke on an almost daily basis about how bizarre and irresponsible it was for the Democratic Party not to have a primary. And while pundits, you don't want to name names, I will. While pundits sure. like Simone Sanders were declaring repeatedly on the mainstream news on MSNBC that there will be no primary, and journalists, like again Simone Sanders, but also folks like the host of Pod Save America, were extremely critical of Dean Phillips for weighing in. We're very dismissive of Marianne Williamson. The Pod Save crew had an incredibly adversarial interview with Dean Phillips, which we should clip in here.
Now, look, you guys have been unkind to me on the show, and I respect you for it, because this is the first time we've met, right? I don't know why there's so much consternation about practicing democracy. It's as simple as that.
We don't have consternation about that.
No, what's the consternation?
Well, here's you're the guy to do it.
If the goal here is to win, if the question here is electability, why on earth would I take a chance on someone who's never run outside of this one specific place and is untested on the national stage?
How many presidents in recent memory did Bill Clinton run anywhere besides Arkansas? Were his numbers even as high as mine right now, just 1 month into guys, come on, you know the truth about this.
All that was going on while there were those of us in the media who were very much saying that's irresponsible given what we can all see about Joe Biden's cognitive status, his ability to do the job, and also polls that reflected that the average American agreed that Joe Biden didn't seem up to the task. So given that I was in the role of being a pundit, of being a host of a show, and was able to say X, Y, and Z, it's not just whether or not you covered up for Biden, but whether or not you used your platform to say the obvious that is sort of being called into question here. And do you think that Jake Tapper articulated the concerns that he articulated to you in the day before the election early enough, early enough for it to matter, I guess, is the people's concern.
I mean, he's already said publicly, and like, I don't, we can have Jake on it some other time, but like Jake has said very publicly, which I think every journalist should say, that he didn't think he was aggressive enough on this story about Biden's cognitive decline. Like, and I think like I really believe that, like, I said this in my speech, it's like acknowledging errors like builds trust, and being defensive about them further erodes it. And Jake has been like, and the thing is, like, Jake was tough on Biden the entire way through, but on this story, he said that he fell short. And I think that's fair, but that does not mean he was carrying water for Biden the entire way through. If you look at his coverage of like Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal, is the first thing that comes to mind, but there are plenty of other issues. He was playing tough. Now, your other question about like Dean Phillips, I mean, the fact that like, honestly, that I have to even get that like, you have to, it was so crazy, the coverage of Dean Phillips in large, that that you have to give credit to the Pod Save America crew for even interviewing him, because MSNBC basically did not have him. I don't believe they had him on until it was clear he was going to lose. I think if you go back and look at it, like for a news network to not even interview a primary challenger to Joe Biden, and Dean Phillips, I think if you read the book, comes across as something of a hero.
He does,
because he didn't want to run. He tried to get other people to run, and eventually he just felt like he had to say something because he thought that Trump, in the same way that like a lot of Democrats believed that Trump was an existential threat, and he was like, we are sleepwalking to disaster. I don't think I am not going to defend like MSNBC or many other people's coverage of Dean Phillips. I think it was clearly, it was obviously an intent to, like, a news network was trying to hurt somebody's candidacy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but do you see how that acknowledgement that CNN, MSNBC choosing not to have Dean Phillips on to hurt his candidacy?
I didn't say CNN. You said CNN.
Oh, okay. Well, who else are we talking? Who else are we talking about?
But I'm just saying. I mean,
those are the two major
because one of the
liberal news channels.
Like was Jake Tapper having Dean Phillips on CNN.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Sure.
Okay.
The mainstream news not having. Choosing not to engage with a Democratic primary candidate. And when they did engage with the fact of his run at all, doing so in such a dismissive way, including the Pod Save people who I will decline to give as much credit as you will. It is hard not to. I'm sorry, absent strong objections from Jake Tapper. I really don't want to make it a reference to him because he's not here to defend himself, and he's not your you're not your brother's keeper. But it does feel difficult to leverage those kinds of criticisms unless there's some clip somewhere of Jake Tapper saying, gosh, the Democratic Party is really failing and acknowledging that there's a real primary happening here, or that there should be a real primary here. And why isn't MSNBC or CNN or whomever hosting debates or town halls the way we would with any other Democratic primary candidate? Absent that sort of advocacy, do you see how it can start to feel a little like Johnny come lately and too little too late to say, well, yes, Dean Phillips was a hero in retrospect. In retrospect, we all should have known. I think that, to come back to my opening question, I think that's the left's criticism, right? Like you made your remarks at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. The establishment was like, don't be mad at us. It's not our fault, blah, 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 blah. How dare you? How dare you? Yeah. But the left was like, yes, finally somebody's saying it. But it was so bloody obvious. It feels almost like gaslighting to be told that this is like a big expose when we've been screaming this at the top of our lungs, not just for 2 years since the primary that wasn't, not just for 4 years since the last election, but going all the way back to to your point, the original sin starting in 2015 when people started observing Biden's cognitive decline after his son's passing.
All the people that feel that way, you have a right to feel that way. Like, I mean, not just like that. That's completely fair. And I understand and think in the same way that people on the right wing that were also pointing out, some of Biden's increasing limitations also also feel frustrated. Well, and also to again, Jake's not here. Like, we can do it, but like Jake called Laura Trump and earlier this year and said, like, I'm gonna go out and say, like, you were right and I was wrong. Which again, like, you can criticize Jake all you want, but I do think, like, journalists, like every single other person, get stuff wrong, and I think it, like, I'd say most journalists I know, or a lot of journalists I know, never acknowledge they're wrong. Now going back to 2019, 2020, I mean, you were there. Like, it is, I think, telling that there were concerns about Biden's abilities back in 2019. You remember, like, the debate where he was asked the question about reparations, and he ended the answer with talking about playing the record player for black kids, essentially, is my memory of it.
Play the radio, make sure make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone, make sure the kids hear words.
And then it's interesting to go back, and I think the book does cover this. It is interesting to go back, like, the 2020 Democratic primary, like, Biden did not win, Bernie lost. And it was because the entire Democratic establishment basically united, like, basically in an break in case of emergency way to stop Bernie, because they were like, oh my God, he's going to win. And
yes.
And Joe Biden was the candidate of last resort, because Bloomberg had defenestrated himself on the debate stage, and Joe Biden was like, they were like, this can work, right? Like, but what is interesting about how we get into, like, the story about how Joe Biden decided to run again and how they were so confident is because Joe Biden's team took the primary win as evidence of all of their, brilliance. When really, like, the primary was about, like, stopping Bernie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yes. And look, I read the section of your book on an earlier episode of this podcast where you talk about that, and where you sort of acknowledge that you don't use these words, but that the election was rigged. That's the language that the Bernie camp has been using for years now. And that Obama picked up a phone, called everybody else to get them to drop out, and that's why we had Biden. And I similarly had this this mixed feeling reading that. Like, on one hand, it's like, finally, they admit it. Like, finally, someone's able just to say out loud what we've been being gaslit about for all these years. Because up until this point, when we made those kinds of arguments, we were told we were spoiled sports. We were told that the reason Bernie didn't lose was because there was something wrong with his policies or his messaging, that he just wasn't popular enough, that, everything was fair, and that he had to rise and fall on his own merit. And now it does feel again like there's a willingness to acknowledge the truth, perhaps only because Bernie Sanders isn't a threat. There's a willingness to acknowledge that Joe Biden had cognitive decline, as you put it, Jake reaching out to you the day before the election because he thinks Biden's going to lose, only because Biden is no longer going to be in power. He's quite obviously too old to run again. And the sort of political consequences or professional consequences of saying the true thing no longer exist. And so while on one level it's gratifying to not have to keep being gaslit in these ways. On the other hand, it's, it's deeply frustrating, right? Because if one only acknowledges the truth when nothing else can be done about it, when you only say that Bernie could have won, or that he was a more electable candidate, or he could have beat Donald Trump, or that the Democratic Party aligned themselves against him in the 2020 primary, in the 2016 primary, only when he's also too old to run or doesn't have the interest in running again, then it feels like the possibility for that kind of reporting to lead to substantive change when it matters is really diminished. Does that make sense?
Well, it completely makes sense. And I would completely understand the frustration from your listeners and from people that really supported and believed and still believe in Bernie. I don't blame that at all. I do think, while, as someone that's been in the mainstream media space for a while, I do think some mainstream reporters let their own ideological leanings influence their reporting. I do not think, people like to, paint the media with a very broad brush, and the media is complicated, like any organization, like any campaign even, right? And that may be true for some, but it's not true for all. And I don't want to make this like a Jake Tapper defense hour, but Jake, I don't think was one of those people. And if people want to disagree, fine. But I understand. He was
pretty hostile to Bernie, I will say, my recollection of it.
Interesting. I mean, you remember it probably much better because you were on the Bernie campaign. I have no idea. But I just think, yes, I understand the frustration. And people like, oh, now they tell us. But I'd also say I guess we felt like the truth had to be said, and if people want to say it's too little too late, or we still don't trust you, whatever, that's up to them. I guess I would just say we thought it was an important story to tell, and we think it's true. I get people's frustration, but I just say I'm doing the best I can.
Let me read a section from your book about exactly what the level of flacking was from the White House when anyone tried to cover this issue. You write in a section called "Shooting the Messengers," the Biden campaign and White House operatives now had a modus operandi for attacking any journalist who covered any questions about the president's age, enlisting a corps of social media influencers, progressive reporters, and Democratic operatives to besmirch as unprofessional and biased those in the news media investigating this line of inquiry. One tame example, a text from Biden campaign operative Brooke Gorin to Democratic operatives said, quote, "Wanted to flag this story. We'd love your help doing some pushback on if you're up for it," she wrote, highlighting a relatively straightforward New York Times story by Michael D. Shear, who had more than 15 years of experience writing about the health of presidential candidates and presidents. Gorin also asked recipients to amplify a tweet from Eric Schultz, Obama's one-time deputy press secretary, who criticized the editors at the Times, saying that they, quote, "cannot help themselves." The goal was to shame journalists and create a disincentive structure for those curious about the president's condition. I'm skipping ahead a little bit now to a quote from Andrew Bates from the White House and TJ Ducklow from the campaign. Quote, "When there were negative news stories about Biden's age, both the campaign and the White House reached out repeatedly and insistently, urging me and others to go negative on the news outlets and reporters. One Democratic operative explained to us they wanted us to shame them on social media, point out how they got the facts wrong, how their takes were biased, and how they weren't holding Trump to the same standards. It was a full-blown freak out whenever these stories dropped." So you're right. There is coverage of the media's role in this, but it's almost... This feels like the main event, right? Because when I read these sections and these quotes, this very much is how it felt anytime you wanted to say the obvious about what you're saying with Joe Biden. These narratives were so pervasive. And I wonder if you as a reporter felt the effect of this attempt to, quote, shame journalists and create this disincentive.
Absolutely. I mean, like, and this is like the reason I even made the remarks at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was because, listen, and I think you as like a political, do you consider yourself still a political operative or more of a reporter now?
I don't know that I ever considered myself a political operative.
Oh, well, okay. Well, but you were on the Bernie campaign, so I didn't know.
I was.
It's like everything the White House did. Actually, if you look back, like people want to like, oh, look at what all like the Biden White House press team did. And just looking at the press team, like all of that is like pretty rational, right? Of like what you would do in a political press operation of like, you want to get people like, I do agree that people and reporters were more easily to be shamed by the Biden White House team than they were from like the Trump White House team. And some of that is because the Trump White House team also lied a bunch more, but also like I do think that is part of emblematic of what we talked about before of like letting people's own personal politics like affecting how they do their job as a reporter. The larger question of, sorry, what was that?
How did this affect you? I mean,
that's why I hate talking about myself, but like it sucked. It sucked. Like I was reporting on Biden's age back in like summer of 2021, and then especially very aggressively in 2023. Not because I was just an observer, but because sources were actually telling me stuff from inside the building. And there is also a difference, I would say, between the left wing and the right wing, like showing clips of like him stumbling and whatever else. And there's a difference between like doing the investigative reporting about what was happening behind the scenes to adapt to his limitations. And especially when I started doing it really aggressively in the spring of 2023, it sucked. It felt lonely. It's, DC, as you know, is like DC is a liberal town, but it is sort of like a big D Democrat town. It's not like a progressive, like it's more party based and ideological, right? And like there are social incentives to covering a Republican president really aggressively and getting, applause around town in a way that there isn't for covering someone like Joe Biden really aggressively. And I do think that affected the reporting.
Alex, you have this really understated way of saying things. That's a bombshell. Like that's insane.
Is it a bombshell? Like you believe that already, right?
I mean, it's not a bombshell in terms of the fact that it's like big, it's new news, but there's a way that the acceptance with which, the fact that everyone just acknowledges that's the way it is in this town. Yeah, it's a big D town. If you want to get a job, you got to, in the next administration, you don't say certain things when the administration is over. Like I break for Bernie and I'm not going to endorse Joe Biden. Everyone just accepts what the done thing to do is, but it's a collective action problem. And the fact that nobody was willing to be the nail sticking above the rest for risk of getting hammered down is exactly why I would argue we have Donald Trump in the White House. And the hypocrisy, frankly, of those of us on the left getting accused of being Trump supporters and facilitating Trump's return to office and the horseshoe theory and the Russian agents and all of that, for being the ones that had the courage to ring the alarm bells, it's still galling to me. I'm still upset by it. And so I really appreciate your willingness to sort of say the obvious as an insider who works in this town, that yes, there were social ramifications to reporting negatively on Joe Biden. And potentially, and I want you to speak to this, were there professional ramifications? I mean, what kind of support were you getting from Axios, or what kind of messaging were you getting internally about the nature of your reporting?
I think this speaks really well to Axios, where, they had my back the entire way, and not just like keep, like we're okay with it, but like actually we're like, do more, keep going. And I think it speaks to sort of the just like aggressiveness, and also just like, reporting ethos of Axios as a company. I'd also say, and I know we've exhausted the Jake Tapper situation, but I do want to say, like, Jake Tapper was also one of the people that was like, great job, like keep going, like, and not everybody was that way, but I had plenty of institutional support, and in fact, I will say, I had much more institutional support of how I covered Joe Biden at Axios than I did at Politico, where I was the first 2 years at the Biden administration. I started West Wing Playbook there, but just like in general, I had more institutional support from the higher ups at Axios than I did at Politico.
What did that look like at Politico?
It's one of those things that honestly, you just feel it. Like, I mean, like anyone that's in a job, when your bosses have your back no matter what, and when they don't. And at Axios, they had my backs no matter what.
I want to ask you about one of the criticisms that I've heard, which is that there's an effort not just to kind of protect the media institutions that fail the public in this moment by focusing on Joe Biden and the people around him implementing a cover up, but also that there's a way that you can take this story and say, well, we really knew things were bad at the debate. And some people knew things were bad at this big White House fundraiser where apparently George Clooney realized that Joe Biden was really off the cliff because he didn't recognize who he was. But that was all sort of in the summer of 2024. And that's the point at which people started to kind of acquire responsibility to say something to the public. There's a version of events that says, or there's a reading of this book that says it has a exculpatory function for those who were pushing Joe Biden in 2020, because the narrative goes, well, there were good and bad days. And I think I've heard Jake Tapper say this. There are good and bad days, but at a certain point, the ratio of good to bad days got to a point where someone had to say something. Another version of events is that there were good and bad days going back to 2015. He wasn't fit to be president in 2016. He certainly wasn't fit to be president in 2020. And focusing on the sort of ratio of good or bad days getting worse and these sort of tipping point events in the summer of 2024, be it the presidential debate or this Hollywood fundraiser, provides cover for those who didn't ring alarm bells earlier on. What do you say to that, or people who might use the book in that sort of an exculpatory way?
That's interesting. Two things. One is like the book shows that there were senior Democrats in 2020. Like there was an event where Biden, because of COVID, did this big Zoom event with a bunch of normal voters. And the footage, the hours of footage was so bad that some senior Democrats became very disillusioned with their entire team. And people that viewed the footage, one person in particular is in the book, said, I didn't think Biden was capable of being president. That person also didn't go public, right? They're only saying it now. So if people want to be like, why didn't you say something earlier? I mean, I think, the perceived threat of Trump made people rationalize doing lots of things, including doing some undemocratic things. I think, in terms of it being, of trying to like the book trying to cover for like people, I mean, of people covering this, I just don't. I don't. I can just tell you what I feel from having done the book and being through the process, which is we felt strongly to not let anyone off the hook. And if you want to, like, I would just encourage people, like, read the book and make up your own mind. You can say, like, we didn't cover the media enough, but we did, as you read earlier, we did cover it. And is it like a sufficient reckoning with what just happened? No, because it's a first draft. Like, we saw this as the first draft of this story, but we thought it was an important story. Even though I had been reporting on it pretty aggressively, like, is it late? Yes. But was it necessary? We thought so.
I have to ask you also about the anonymity point. Mm-hmm. Can you walk me through the decision making? You referenced these senior cabinet members who were raising these concerns, people who were the closest to Joe Biden, who did not think he was up to the job, not just in he's not good at the social or kind of media aspects of being a president, but that he doesn't seem to have the stamina to make the sorts of decisions that are necessary at the highest levels. These people, their kind of testimony here in the book is really core to the credibility of the argument and to the sort of perversity of how high up this went. And yet they are unwilling to go on the record. Can you walk me through the decision-making to grant them anonymity, what kind of pushback you gave them to try to force them to go on the record or encourage them to go on the record, and how you came to the decision to allow them those conditions of anonymity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd also say, like, the one thing I wanted to add before is that, like, I perhaps naively, like, I am still such a believer in the importance of, like, reporting. And so while some of this conversation has been focused on the media shortcomings, I really believe in the importance of, like, aggressive, adversarial media. I just think, like, have we done stuff? And I said in my speech, like we are partially responsible for, like, trust in media being at such lows. But I do still think the mission is very important. Now, to your question about how you sort through granting anonymity to cabinet members, including cabinet members that were saying that in 2024, they no longer had confidence Joe Biden could respond to a 3 a.m. crisis. I would say a few things. One is we interviewed over 200 people after the election, like from November 6th till probably like February 15th or so. We interviewed over 200 people. In part, the reason why we interviewed so many people is because we were reliant on many anonymous sources. And if you're relying on anonymous sources, you should interview as many as possible, because sometimes anonymous sources lie or are not being completely candid. When it came to the cabinet members, it was one of those things where they would only, and I don't think they are, like, completely key to the entire argument. If you read the full book, I think, like, they are a part of it, but I don't think the thesis of the book relies on them. But it is a good question, because we entered into those discussions with the cabinet members with the agreement it would be anonymous. And then we were shocked with what they said. And then we basically got to a point when they would not go on the record. And then we had a decision to make. And if it had been one cabinet member, maybe we would have just been like, no. But we had 4 cabinet members. And then the decision was, is it still newsworthy to include it? Even if they are anonymous. And we're not going to break our agreement, and they won't go on the record. And we came to the conclusion that it was still newsworthy and worth it to include it, especially given that it was multiple members of the cabinet that expressed concerns about Joe Biden's age.
Yeah, I can see it both ways. I hear you saying that you sort of didn't necessarily anticipate the bombshells of what they were going to tell you. And so you went into it agreeing to anonymity. And then maybe it sounds like had some if not regrets, then certainly second thoughts about, a desire for them to go on the record once you realize the gravity of what they were saying.
You want everyone to go on the record.
Sure.
As a reporter, you want everyone. But like sometimes people will only talk anonymously.
Do you think that you would have maybe, in retrospect, not gone into the conversation with them granting anonymity? Do you think you still would have been able to get them to talk to you, at least some of them to talk to you, without first granting that condition? And would you have gone about it differently, knowing what you know now about what they said?
Probably, in all candor, probably not, because sometimes you can only get people to sit down with you if you promise to grant them anonymity as a reporter. And that's just the truth. And if anyone wants to say, if any reporter wants to say, I will never sit down with a powerful person unless it's completely on the record, fine. But I just don't operate that way.
So, I mean, it's interesting because I think part of why the anonymity piece comes into play or comes into question, particularly for these cabinet members, is because to the extent that there is any accountability that flows from your reporting, it can't attach, right? If the people who admit they sort of knew better are anonymous. And I hear the point that they wouldn't have confessed if they knew their words could be used against them. But this also kind of goes to other sources throughout the book. This 200 people that you interviewed, many of whom are some combination of elected, appointed, core figures in the Democratic Party, all of whom are willing to admit now, some on the record and some off the record, that they knew at some point before the 2024 election that Joe Biden was not cognitively fit to be president, and yet they kept that from the public. And I think part of the story that's so interesting to me is the sort of shifting excuses for why that is. There are many people who you write basically argue, but we're stuck with Biden now. There's nothing that we can do about it. It's too late, which is a narrative that doesn't really gel for me with the reality that they did pull him 100 days before the election and chose to forego a primary, which could have yielded a stronger candidate than Kamala Harris. But ultimately we got Kamala Harris, and we know how that story got written.
Well, I don't think there's anything to really contest with what you just said.
So then I wonder, go ahead.
I guess I would also say the thing that I also find compelling about what you just said is that a lot of people just want to blame Joe Biden. And that's not fair because many senior Democrats across the Senate and the House and in the party knew, even if they believed that he could win in November of 2024, they knew, and they said so privately, many of them, they did not believe he could be president until 2029, which is what he was running to do. And so, yeah, I think I completely agree. The idea that the Democratic Party did such a brave thing by kicking Biden out of the race, essentially, they did not do that out of political courage because they didn't think he was up to the job. They only did it because they now thought he was going to lose. It had nothing to do with his ability to do the job for 4 more years. It all had to do with the fact that, oh my goodness, he's confirmed everyone's worst fears. And now we're going to lose Senate seats in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona and Nevada and a bunch of House seats throughout the country.
But I agree entirely. And on top of that, they knew or should have known he was going to lose a long time before that, because the reporting is also that Joe Biden's internal polling was showing him down 400 electoral votes or something like that to Donald Trump much earlier in the year in 2024. I mean, that is what is so mind-boggling about this, but we don't have to go over and over again.
Really quick, I think that 400 number, just to I think that was after the debate, but yes, his pollsters showed him losing much, much earlier than the debate.
As we wrap here, I wanted to ask you what you make of Karine Jean-Pierre's recent news that she is writing a book that is sort of the the mirror universe version of yours, it seems. She has expressed some discontent with the Democratic Party, says she's going to be an independent, and that she has written this book about the Joe Biden cover-up, saying basically that she's leaving the Democratic Party because the party wasn't nice enough to Joe Biden, that they shouldn't have pushed him out. What do you make of this take?
I can tell you what a lot of her former colleagues make of this, which is outrage and fury and increasing frustration that somebody who basically her main constituency was the Democratic Party and rose to the top spokesperson in the country because of the backing of the Democratic Party. Not because she was a Biden person, by the way. And then she goes out and says she's an independent and then blames the Democratic Party. You cannot underestimate you cannot underestimate the rage from her former colleagues, especially given that most of them did not think she was good at her job and resented the fact that they had to work harder because she did not work, in their opinion, that they felt like she did not put in the work that it takes to do that job. And there was, and then the fact that she then goes out and honestly, I tried to get those stories, and I did a few here and there when she was press secretary. But there were people that felt this way for a long time, but they wouldn't even put stuff on background, not even anonymously. They were just off the record. And this book was the last straw for even her last defenders. I'm sure she still has a few here and there, but I can tell you it is a very small group now.
Well, Alex, are they mad at her because she is criticizing the Democratic Party and leaving the Democratic Party? Or are they mad at her for her kind of continued defense of Joe Biden? Because I don't give it personally. I'm not a Democrat. I don't give a damn. She leaves the Democratic Party. But what's galling to me is that she has the audacity at this point in time, in the year of our Lord 2025, to be arguing that the Democratic Party's failure was not in the cover-up, but that it didn't complete the cover-up.
Yeah, that she was the betrayal of the Democratic Party. You know, the critiques are varying. I would say that on balance, I'd say sort of the average critique is that the idea that she would try to like to your point, I'm going to leave the Democratic Party because they were too mean to Joe Biden. People just don't, it doesn't compute. It makes their brains malfunction.
Yeah, it's really ridiculous. It is really ridiculous. And that is, I think, part of the frustration as we're going forward. I would love it to be the case that when you made your, I think, really appropriate, to say the least, speech at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, that it was a moment for mea culpa in the White House, among the DC press. I would like to think that when this book comes out, it causes new newsrooms to interrogate their own coverage and their susceptibility to the flacking from the White House, to raise questions about access journalism and the extent to which perhaps mainstream news orgs are willing to run cover for a Democratic nominee or spin narratives about electability and Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and all the mishigas of 2020, to continue to use race as a cover for Democratic Party excesses, like, as you write about in the book, the choice to move the primary schedule to put South Carolina first, admitting behind the scenes that it has everything to do with Joe Biden winning, but publicly saying this is about centering Black voters, and on and on and on. I would like to think that there was a big wake-up call from all of that. But going forward, what we're seeing just this past week with the ouster of David Hogg for having the temerity to say that we should have primary challenges to aging Democrats who keep dying in office and costing Democrats important votes on the floor, that it doesn't seem like there is really any accountability going forward. And I do wonder what you think the takeaways from the book, how you're feeling now that sort of you're at the end of your media arc talking about this book and the country has sort of digested the messages from this book. How are you feeling about accountability and progress going forward within the Democratic Party?
It's interesting. I would not put, while like the David Hogg is obviously young and as like an avatar, but I do think he is part of a larger group. You've seen like a lot of young Democrats challenge older Democrats. Steny Hoyer, you obviously have Kat in Illinois who basically forced retirement. You have like a few people making like the age argument. But we didn't write the book to like to force a political outcome. Like at least maybe I'm being naive, but like as an old, like I still believe in the old school reporting of like you put the facts out there as best you can, and then you're gonna see what the outcome is. But like it's really on the Democratic Party. Like I can say like the Democratic Party leaders, in part because they are all very much on tape, on camera, saying that Joe Biden is great and as sharp as ever and has a photographic memory.
Some of them are still saying it. Jim Clyburn and what's his name? The chair, the DNC chair, former Jamie Harrison.
Oh, Jamie Harrison. Yeah, they're still saying
We're both saying that.
Do you think that Joe Biden really would have been able to perform as president all the way through January 2029 when he would be 86?
Yes, I thought that back then. I still think that, but I don't know that. When people ask me, did I know this or did I know the other? And the fact of the matter is, no, I didn't. And you make my point here. So it's not all about age. I've seen people develop Alzheimer's when they're in their 30s and 40s. So it's not about age. It's about the ability to do the job. And I never saw anything that allowed me to think that Joe Biden was not able to do the job. Just that simple.
Yeah, they're still saying it. Like the leaders of the Democratic Party do want to yada 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 their way through this. The question is whether or not voters are going to let them. And that's not our job or our responsibility.
But Alex, of course it is. Part of why voters only know what they're told, right?
Well, we're gonna still ask questions and still cover it, right? Like we're gonna push them to answer questions, but I don't know how much voters are going to care. That's like so that's what I mean.
You don't know how much voters are going to care about what?
About the fact that all these Democratic leaders covered for a president they knew was not up to doing the job for 4 more years.
Well, Alex, you know that they care, right? Like, you have to believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that some aspect of the low approval ratings of the Democratic Party, of the loss that Kamala has suffered in 2024, has a direct link to voters feeling like they were misled and poorly served by their party. I mean, the complete absence of any commentary from Democratic Party leadership over the war in Iran. I mean, we're recording this on Friday, June 20th. And as of today, unless something happens earlier in the day that I didn't notice, that I didn't catch, we haven't heard a peep from Chuck Schumer about Iran. I mean, like, there's no Democratic Party leadership, and people want something new. There's the age-old Princeton study from 2014 that shows we don't live in a democracy because there's no relationship between what elected officials advocate for, what they're willing to propose, and what the voters actually want. I mean, all of this, I think, it feeds into the disaffectation. And the media's unwillingness, in large part, to corroborate what they saw with their lying eyes is a huge part of that. No?
I think, honestly, like, you're going to think I'm dodging, but the truth is I just don't know how much of, like, the Democratic Party's low approval rating is tied to this story. I think it's a good argument that it is. But again, I don't know how much, like, and this is not me comparing the two events, but after January 6th, clearly, like, the voters felt one way about January 6th as opposed to like the elites, the Republican Party, like on the GOP side, right? Like, I don't know, like, do voters are just like, we just care about beating Donald Trump and we don't really care. Like, yes, Biden was old and yes, he was too old to do the job, but we don't really care. Maybe. I just don't know. It just, this is not me being, I think like you make a persuasive argument, but also I don't like predicting or assuming.
There's been a sort of, I think mostly kind of an academic conversation about journalistic objectivity that I'm sure you remember from some years back. I think it really hit a fever pitch during 2020 when there were, predominantly Black journalists in the newsroom saying that everybody had these biases and they were being criticized unfairly for being sort of open about theirs, and that it was the directionality of the bias that was really the problem. The fact that they were being sort of pro-BLM or, pushing back against the journalistic inclination to just report out police reports without any pushback, and that was seen as bias, whereas the status quo of printing whatever the police tell you and yada, 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 and having the law and order angle wasn't, right? And so then we had in this conversation about journalistic objectivity, and I think that there was this, more classic view that journalists are neutral that I think isn't really in line with reality. I gotta say, that's my perspective. I know this is like the woke case, but it does strike me as sort of impossible to say as a journalist, like, I'm gonna report on, this chemical factory leaking chemicals into this community and causing cancer, but I don't want it to cause, I'm not reporting on that because I want it to promote any change, right? Any political change, any social change, any change. Of course, it has to be the case, right? That the reason that you want to report on Biden's cognitive ability is to give voters the option of making an informed choice about who they want running and leading their party, right? And that is a political change. And that's not saying that you have like a directional dog on the fight, but the obvious political implications of your reporting are what they are. And that's where the sense of responsibility, I think, comes from or should come from. And where my sense of sort of anger that there weren't more people willing to do this reporting when it could have counted comes from. Do you see this differently? You feel like somehow this is neutral?
Well, I do see it differently. I mean, I know all these arguments about like, and I will grant the argument that no reporter is neutral, and that they are affected by their own biases, of where they come from, of their own political beliefs, of everything. And any journalist that like says they're not is not being honest with other people or with themselves. I still think that neutrality is a virtue, is something to strive for, to get as close as you possibly can, because I do think reporting at its most, with its most impact comes from when people trust the information. And I do believe that people trust the information when you report in a way that is like, I want the most skeptical person of this story to still be like, there's something here. And I think that's still really important in an age when people are struggling to know what's the truth. So I still am like a defender. I know it's not like popular on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever. I'm still a defender in like the cause of press neutrality. As for like sort of the broader press, like, I don't know, if I knew how to like restore press credibility, loom large, it'd be probably like much more successful. But I can just do what I can do, which is I just try to like, as much as I can, I try to like tell what I know is true. And I also really try, because I know I have my own internal biases, like I really try to gut check myself constantly and call people that I know disagree with my other sources. And I do think I just try to get as close to that as possible. But that's not to say that like partisan journalists, I mean, one of the most, significant, the consequential journalists of the last, 25 years was Glenn Greenwald, with a combination of the Snowden and then also what he did in Brazil. Like, and he was an out and out, like he had a clear point of view and he was not shy about that. And so I'm not saying that all journalists should or have to do that. I'm just saying that in terms of like my role and what I see myself is, I still cling to the sort of more old model, but that's not saying I do think some like old school reporters get in a mode of like dismissing anyone that's a quote unquote partisan or ideological journalist. Like I think there's room for both.
I think there is too. And not that you're asking me directly for suggestions, but it seems to me that if there was some actual accountability for folks who like missed this story, if there were some changes, personnel changes in newsrooms for people potentially at Politico who you felt were, disapproving of coverage critical of Biden for ideological reasons and because this is a capital D Democrat town, if there were cabinet members who found themselves out of favor in Washington because they sat on information that the president of the United States wasn't capable of making 3 a.m. phone call style decisions. If there were Democratic leadership newly elected who didn't keep repeating this mantra of we're not going to look back, we're going to look forward, the way Ken Martin has been doing. And then a party that wasn't more invested in ousting David Hogg than it was actually holding real people who betrayed the American public accountable. I think all of those things could restore credibility or start to restore credibility in the Democratic Party and the media establishment among regular Americans. That's what I think.
And it's fair enough. I would say that I do hope, even if people think that it's too little too late, I do really hope that this book, Original Sin, which you can buy right now, will at least like contribute a little bit to restoring faith in media.
I do want to say it because I've been tough on you, and I want to make sure that we restore our neighborly graces.
Yes, if you don't include like the bit from before, for everyone that's listening, we literally live within I think we're probably 6 feet from each other right now, but in different apartments. Every
time you see me at this set, which is a table in my kitchen, know that Alex Thompson is on the other side of this wall. That's what's happening right now. I discovered this, by the way, when I got your mail one day, because our mailboxes are like this because our numbers are adjacent.
Yes.
And I went to return it and I Googled, wait a minute, Alex Thompson. I know that name. Are you Alex Thompson from Twitter? I think is what I DM'd you. And that's how we discovered this. Yeah. But yeah, I do want to be really clear that I know I saw the backlash that you got and I know how hard it was to write this book and to say what you said at the Correspondents' Dinner. And I hope you felt support from those of us on the left who might be critical of the media in a lot of different, contexts, and who might be frustrated that, this is a story that didn't come out early enough to change the course of the election and things like that, but who are still very grateful for you for writing this book, for saying what you said, and for also saying some truths about the rigging of the Bernie race and some of the other perversities that have gone on within the Democratic Party. So thank you. And I strongly, strongly recommend that people read this book. We didn't get into it because you've done a lot of other interviews and I wanted to spend the time sort of talking about these sort of ancillary issues. Mm-hmm. But the actual nuggets of how bad things were, how deep this goes, the Steven Spielberg being brought in to adjust the mic and the lighting to try to make Biden look more alive. I mean, it's really outrageous and a really, really fun is not the right word, but like a kind of a gripping read. So strong recommend, pick up Original Sin. Alex, I'll return the copy that you lent me.
No, you don't have to return it, or just like you should just bring it over and I'll sign it for you. But it's yours.
Oh, wonderful!
Forever. And
that's so funny. I'm like marking up in pencil so I can give it back to you.
Also, like these are the questions that should be asked, and people too often like you asked everything in like a thoughtful and earnest way. And people too often, because they don't want to offend people, don't ask things in like thoughtful, earnest ways. So I think like all the challenges you did were great. Yeah. I think it's an important conversation, and people should feel free to always ask.
It is tough. I mean, the Axios journalism question, for instance, is a tough one for me because I feel like my responsibility really is to ask tough questions. And I am very aware of the fact that means that I have a diminishing pool of people who are willing to come on my show. I was so glad that Jamal Bowman came on. I'm not especially optimistic that he's going to come on again, for instance. So I do appreciate your willingness to come on, Alex. And I hope some other folks in the left media space reach out to you and invite you on as well. And I'd love to talk to Jake Tapper himself if he feels so inclined. I will confess that I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder for a segment he did about me back when I was the national press secretary for Bernie. When I mistakenly referred to Michael Bloomberg, who had 2 stent procedures, which you get usually because you had a heart attack, as having had a heart attack, although he's never admitted to the same. And Jake Tapper dedicated a segment about how I was lying and smearing Michael Bloomberg to advance the interest of Bernie Sanders. So I guess I'm going to have to just get over that.
I have no knowledge of this, and so I am not wading into these waters.
Fair enough. Alex, thank you so much. Where can people find more of you on the internet and beyond?
On X, I'm at Alex THOMP, Alex Tomp. I have a Substack. I'm on Instagram at ALXTHOMP. You can find me on all the socials, LinkedIn, whatever. And if anyone's listening to this and reads the book and has thoughts, criticisms, like opinions, we are going to do a paperback. So, I'd love to know what you think, and just let me know.
All right, sounds great. Thanks for tuning in. You all know you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week on Mondays by subscribing to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. As always, thanks for tuning in and keep the faith.